Look, a lot of you guys are lying or living in blatant denial about the SEC. You see, people want to try to demean how good the SEC is just for the sake of making the argument for why a one-loss Indiana team should be in the playoffs and why they should snub a two-loss Ole Miss, Alabama, Georgia, A&M, whoever. And the thing that people kind of are ignoring is that the SEC is without a doubt the best conference in college football. Since the year 2000, this conference has won 13 out of the last 20 national championships. They have never gone more than 2 years without winning a national championship since that span. Okay, you've had Florida State, Clemson, won it a few times in between the last decade or so, but for the majority of the last 20 years, the SEC has dominated when it comes to winning national championships. You also have a conference that has produced the most draft picks out of any other P4 conference for 17 straight years. And this season alone, the SEC has a 10-5 record against all of the other Power 4 conferences. They're 5-2 against the ACC. They're 2-2 against the Big 12. They're 3-1 against the Big 10. The only SEC school that dropped the game to a Big 10 foe was when LSU lost to USC week 1 this year. Overall, this conference has proven that they not only are the best conference in college football based off the level of talent that's in this conference, but also based off their record head-to-head against the other P4 conferences. I get that not every two-loss SEC team should be included into the playoffs. That's not the argument that I'm trying to make. The argument that I'm saying is that you can't say playing in the SEC should be viewed the same as playing in the Big 12 because the quality of teams from top to bottom in the Big 12 is not as good from the quality of teams that you have in the SEC. The SEC is pretty much college football's equivalent to what the NFL is. There's not a wide gap and disparity between the top teams in this conference and the middle of the pack teams in this conference. That's why they have 5 to 6 teams right now that are going to have at least 10 wins this season. You don't have that same amount of quality depth in the Big Ten. The Big Ten has been a 3-man race for the last 4 to 5 years. It's only been Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. This year of conference realignment with Oregon, USC, Washington, and UCLA joining the conference now, it's been a 4-team race where you got Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon, and Indiana. But not all 4 of those teams deserve to get in. Just like not how every two-loss SEC team deserves to get in. You see, it's one-sided where you're going to say, okay, well, just because you play in a more deeper, more tougher conference doesn't justify you being able to get in, even though the conference is more tougher because you have 2 losses. Well, if that's the case, then you being able to take advantage of having a weaker schedule shouldn't help you be a beneficiary to get into the playoffs then, because at the end of the day, you can't penalize these SEC schools for being good and meanwhile incentivizing Indiana for being able to beat up on weak competition. Everybody always wants to say what's fair, what's unfair. Well, it's not fair that the SEC gets more teams in and the Big 12 and the ACC don't have the ability to do so. Everybody should have the same opportunity to compete for a national championship. Well, guess what? College football has never really been even. These G5 schools don't have the same ability to win a national title as these teams in the SEC, Big 10, ACC, or Big 12 do. College football has never been a level playing field. Ever since this sport first got played a century ago, there's always been a big gap between the elite teams and the average teams in college football. The thing is that the SEC is so deep that everybody is about on the same scale that is on pace to have 10 wins. There's not a big discrepancy between the top team in the SEC right now and the team that's ranked 6th or 7th in this conference. Because all these teams are relatively equal in talent. Meanwhile, in the Big Ten, the gap between the top 4 teams in the Big Ten right now versus the rest of the field in that conference is comparing apples to oranges, which is why the SEC has a right to demand a certain amount of teams to get a guaranteed spot. I'm not saying that every 2-loss SEC team deserves to be in, but we can't ignore strength of schedule. Strength of schedule has to matter. If the losses are going to matter, then who you lose to and who you beat has to matter too. You can't tell me that Georgia, who's gone on the road, has had the toughest road schedule in college football, having to play Ole Miss, Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas, and Alabama on the road, along with Tennessee at home, should be viewed the same as Indiana. The only tough game they play is on the road in Columbus against Ohio State, because that's not a fair argument. Indiana's schedule doesn't have the level of difficulties that Georgia does. If Indiana had to play Georgia's schedule, there's a good chance that they aren't 10-0. And I'm not going to say that Indiana couldn't be 10-0 with Georgia's schedule, because, you never know what could happen any given Saturday. But it's more difficult to go undefeated in the SEC or only have one loss in SEC conference play than it is in the Big Ten, because there's a considerable gap between the top 4 teams in that conference and the rest of the field in the Big Ten. Meanwhile, the SEC has more teams that are on pace to finish with 9 wins or more than what the Big Ten does of teams that are going to be bowl eligible. You got to stop acting like college football is being played on an even playing field when it's not. Everybody is playing a different level of competition when it comes to conference play. And with the SEC's history, it's right to say that they deserve more spots in the playoffs based off how difficult their schedule has been compared to the rest of everybody else. And listen, if you disagree with that, okay, and let's say that the SEC does have a good amount of teams that get snubbed. You want to know what's going to happen? Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC, you know what he could say? He could say, you know what? If you guys are going to penalize us for just being a good conference, then we're going to pack our bags. We're going to distance ourselves from everybody else, and we're going to create our own conference. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to get the Big Ten to join us, and we're going to basically have college football's equivalent to the AFC, NFC. What a lot of y'all forgot is that before it was ever agreed upon to expand from 4 to 12 teams, all these conference commissioners had to sign off on this. And the Big Ten and the SEC gave pretty specific, requirements for what they were looking for in terms of them giving their seal of approval on this. And it was either they get more guaranteed spots or they get a higher share of the revenue. A lot of people didn't like the idea of the SEC and the Big Ten being guaranteed more spots than the rest of the other conferences, but they overlooked how difficult playing in these conferences are based off them having more quality teams than the rest of college football. There's only 2 or 3 good ACC teams this year. They don't deserve the same amount of teams at the table as what the Big Ten and the SEC are. I get it that you play who's on your schedule, but in college football, unlike the NFL, you can somewhat control who you play out of conference. You can't control playing a FIU or a whoever university early into the season to get easy wins because you pay money to beat those teams. The SEC, what they can say is that, okay, if you guys don't think that we're playing on the same playing field and you're just going to ignore how difficult it is to win in this conference, we're going to separate. And when that happens, then the rest of college football just becomes irrelevant because the Big Ten, the SEC, they're going to do their own thing. And the largest fan bases are in the Big Ten and in the SEC. They run college football. A lot of y'all hate to admit that. A lot of y'all are living in denial about the SEC and how good this conference truly is because you're tired of the domination and the monopoly that the SEC has had on college football for the last 20 years. But just because you don't like it doesn't mean that you making an argument to try to demean how good this conference is makes your argument any stronger. If anything, it makes it weaker. The reason why we've gotten to 12 teams is because everybody thinks that everybody's going to have a fair chance to win a national championship when that's not going to happen. What you were hoping for with the playoffs expanding from 4 to 12 is that you get more parity. You don't have to see the same teams in the Big Ten and the SEC competing in the Final Four for the national championship every year. But all you did by expanding the more teams was make it more easier for that to continue to happen. The only team or the only thing that kept the SEC and the Big Ten from winning national championships every year was the fact that it was more difficult to get into the 14 playoffs than it was getting into the 12-team playoffs because the margin of error was smaller. You could only afford to lose one game in the regular season if you wanted to get into the 14 playoffs. But now, with it expanding to 12, you pretty much guaranteed that Georgia and Alabama are going to be in the dance every single year until Kirby Smart and Kalen DeBoer retire. The Big 12 doesn't even recruit in the top 25 mostly. Their teams are nowhere as good as what these SEC and Big Ten schools are. Now, every once in a while, there are upsets that occur. But this year, though, you're going to see just how dominant the Big Ten and the SEC are because I guarantee you that we probably are going to have a Big Ten SEC Final Four. The biggest fear that most of us had about this 12-team playoffs is that it becomes the Big Ten SEC Invitational. Nobody wants to see that, but that's what's going to transpire. The SEC is the toughest conference in college football. The difference between them and the Big Ten is that the gap between the top 6 teams in the SEC is pretty much none. There is no gap. They all are just as good, which is why it's pretty much a log jam at the top of that conference. We could have a crazy tiebreaker scenario where we have 5, 6, 10, and 2 teams in the SEC, and you pretty much have to flip a coin or use some crazy tiebreaker procedures to determine who gets into the conference title game. Meanwhile, in the Big Ten, Penn State, they avoided playing Oregon and they avoided playing Indiana. But yet, Ohio State have to play both Oregon and Penn State, which is why they get in. Nobody's denying Ohio State a seat at the table, even if they lose somehow to Indiana this weekend. You're still going to put them in because they got a pretty tough schedule. But to just flat out lie and say that the SEC is overrated is nonsense to me because you're only saying that because you're trying to make an argument for a team that doesn't really have the resume or the backing to get into the playoffs over a 2-loss SEC team, because you can't say that playing in the SEC is the same as playing in the Big 12 when it's not. If you were to put BYU in the SEC, they would not be a 1-loss team at the moment. And we saw this play out. We saw Michigan lose to TCU, right? And we got the parity that everybody wanted. We got the Big 12 team into the national championship, and they got splattered by Georgia. It was one of the worst national championships that we've ever seen because the gap in talent was just so large that it wasn't even a fair fight. You're going to see more of what happened in that Georgia TCU national championship when these playoffs take place this year, because a lot of y'all who are living in denial about how good the SEC is, you're about to find out just how truly wrong you are when the playoffs kicks off, because the best teams mostly are in the SEC. Now, upsets do happen, but the chances of an upset occurring to a SEC team are smaller compared to the chances of an upset occurring to a Big Ten team outside of Ohio State and Oregon. I could see Penn State being a first-round exit. Same thing with Indiana, and I could see both those teams getting blown out. Same thing with Miami. I'm a diehard Miami Hurricanes fan, but we are nothing more than Cam Ward. Cam Ward is our team. You take him off this squad, Miami is an 8-9 win team at best. You can say that the SEC isn't that good, but at the same time, though, this conference, if you were to put Oregon and Ohio State in the SEC, neither one of those squads would finish with only one loss. Both of those teams would have 2 losses due to how difficult the schedule would be. Georgia had to play 3 road games against 3 teams that were favored to win this conference, right behind them in Bama, Ole Miss, and Tennessee, along with Texas. So, I mean, you can't really say that the SEC is overrated when they got a winning record against all of the other P4 conferences. They produced the most draft picks than anybody else. You're basically just denying the truth, and you're trying to live in this delusion that just is a false reality. And when these playoff games take place, I can't wait for everybody to realize just how big of a talent gap there is between the SEC and the Big Ten and the rest of college football. And you see, you're going to be mad if the Big Ten and SEC just take their stuff and they just say, you know what, we're going to do our own thing. Then what are you going to say? Because if you were to erase, if the SEC is so overrated, right, let's just remove all the SEC teams from the college football playoffs. And you tell me if the field looks stronger with or without the SEC. But if you remove the ACC and the Big 12, nobody would notice. Those teams aren't going to go that far anyway. When we saw Colorado play Oregon last year, it was a slaughter fest. And if they were to play Oregon this year, the outcome wouldn't be that different. Although Colorado probably will be able to put up a little bit more of a fight, they probably still lose that game by a considerable margin. I'm not going off hypothetical odds and hypothetical situations. I'm telling you the facts. The SEC has won 13 out of the last 20 national championships. Right behind them, it's been the Big Ten with Michigan. You had Ohio State with Urban Meyer. And then in the ACC, you had Clemson winning a few times, along with Florida State winning it once. We got to stop acting like the SEC isn't a more tougher conference due to there being more tougher teams than the rest of college football.